Hello folks, well Season 1 isn't quite fully underway as we do still have one raid and a delve to get access to. We're nevertheless at a point where I think that I have a decent handle on how Midnight is shaping up, and so it's a good time to do my regular expansion launch review, starting of course with the level up experience, followed by taking a look at the max level offerings. The expansion begins with a call from Lady Liadrin and Turalian to join the defense of Silvermoon. The original intro cinematic for Midnight, of course, saw an army of the light be summoned through the Sunwell at Lady Liadrin's desperate behest. Now, of course, logging in to be involuntarily yeeted to Silvermoon would not be a great gameplay experience, and so we had to make do with a ghostly image of Liadrin and Turalian inviting us to accept a handy portal to the scene. For me, this beginning was a little bit flat compared to that epic cinematic. I get why the developers did it this way, but at the same time I do wonder if they could have done more to make us feel like a part of that vanguard of the light and not just an afterthought. The intro experience itself was for me merely okay. The questing experience was fine, but at the same time, despite a high density of enemies and the ongoing battle, it really didn't make me feel like I was ever facing overwhelming odds, and it very much lacked that frenetic pace that we saw in something like Warlords of Draenor's desperate flight through the Tanaan jungle. And the culmination with the launch of the Sunwell's death beam into the skies, that really should have been an epic event, but instead for me it kind of felt anticlimactic. Moving into the level up experience proper, and I do want to get something out of the way straight away. The revamp of Silvermoon is absolutely spectacular, perfectly capturing the spirit of the Burning Crusade original, which until now had been one of the most beautiful and evocative cities in the game, and seeing Silvermoon expand into the former ruins left by the Scourge while retaining the old Silvermoon as a Horde-only enclave successfully resolved the issue of the Horde potentially losing, in inverted commas, one of their major cities. My only disappointment is that the new music track, while very good, does not capture the unique atmosphere that was created by the Burning Crusade original, and instead kinda just feels like a generic fantasy orchestral soundtrack. And I feel that this could have benefited from making much greater musical references back to the original than it actually does. That said, I have been enjoying the soundtrack for Astalor's Sanctum a lot, albeit this feels much more like something I'd expect to be associated with the Naga than a shady blood elf. Moving into Eversong Woods, and the quality of that revamp continues to shine. The decision to heal the original Dead Scar has had a mixed response in the community, but I personally very much appreciate seeing that damage being healed over by nature, and I do very much like the visible dip in the landscape which marks that remains of the scars. And frankly, I'm mystified whenever I hear people in the community say that it's not visible. Really? Honestly, don't you guys have eyes? Anyways, moving on to the storyline, and again, there is a lot to like as we progress through it. The betrayal of Tranquillin by its governor was telegraphed early on, but sometimes it can be very satisfying for the audience to be in the know, and this was a great example of that in action. That said, for me, the ending of the Eversong Woods campaign was a little bit disappointing. I have a suspicion that the developers were perhaps a bit scared of forcing players into what was an unjust fight against what would soon become allies. Now that left us to experience only the aftermath of that tragic and misguided fight, given that we players were there for the start. The result was a story that has a beginning and an ending, but which missed the middle out completely. And the clash between Turalian and his son Arathor, while having an enormous potential to be an epic moment, was marred by a cinematic with very poorly executed facial animations, which combined with the pacing of the story to make it fall a little bit flat for me. After this, I decided to do the Arathor storyline next. With the benefit of hindsight, this wasn't the most optimal choice, But even so, I greatly enjoyed watching Alonso's foe conspiring with Turalian's old comrades from the Sons of Lothar to lead Arathor on a journey of self-discovery, helping him to better understand his father's reaction. And I also very much appreciated seeing and even being able to aid the struggles of those who are maintaining the Sunwell's death beam in the sky. Despite that success, when I was flying into Zulaman to pick up its story, I will admit to having felt an odd sense of malaise. Usually, the initial level up experience of a World of Warcraft expansion is for me one of its highlights, but that just wasn't the case this time around, at least so far in the process. Despite that feeling of malaise, it wasn't very long before the Zulaman storyline managed to begin to draw me in. Again, it was very obvious that this was going to end with the return of the Amani lore, but I was not expecting that return to begin as quickly as it ended up doing. Making a leap of faith off a high ledge to win over Azokon was, let's be honest, just a copy and paste for Zuldazar's Haku's storyline in Battle for Azeroth, albeit one with a less epic resolution. I mean, come on, Zuljara drifting back up to the ledge on a wind cloud just doesn't compare with the idea of Azokon swooping down to pick us up in their claws. And how did my player character get back up to the ledge exactly? Despite that, this narrative did still have a strong feel-good factor, but that was a pale shadow of what was about to come. Halazi's refusal to offer Zuljara a trial, recognising instead her journey to find them was incredibly satisfying, and in the side quest lines where we continue to help the Amani reconnect with minor lore, helped to combine to mean that overall the Zulaman story was by far the highlight of the whole experience for me. Moving on next to Harandar, and like many other players, I never really gelled with the storyline here. For me, the Elder's resistance just never felt real to me, likely because the other Haranir that I met on my journey were far more welcoming than really made sense for a race who from their original reveal in The War Within were supposed to be extremely insular and unwilling to even speak with outsiders. And the climax of that story where Hagar led a surprise vanguard of Haranir to the aid of Eversong's beleaguered defenders, well, that should have been an epic moment, but just wasn't. And her intervention really only made any sense if you happen to have read the short story that Blizzard released a couple of days into early access. That said, the Zone of Harandar itself is rather lovely, and the background music is for me one of the best Zone soundtracks that we've seen since BFA's Vol'dun or Shadowlands Revendreth. But before I move on, finishing the Zone of Harandar in early access gave us a countdown timer bar to the end of early access, setting strong expectations for some sort of max level storyline chapter. Unfortunately, instead, when that timer did run out, all we got was a single quest that can be best summed up as, I know we don't like outsiders, but for now, let's team up. And that was it for unlocking the Haranir. If there ever was a case of Blizzard overpromising and under-delivering, this was it. Moving on to the Void Storm, and my mixed response was to continue. The design of the zone itself does make sense for something that exists within the Void realm, being desolate and lifeless and all sharp corners and spikes, as did its similarities with the zone of Koresh. However, having two zones that were so similar, so close together, for me did feel a bit samey and familiar. And one thing that I am learning is that I really don't enjoy these depictions of desolate and hostile areas in the WoW cosmos, finding them to be very oppressive even from a gameplay point of view. Story-wise, I really enjoyed the character of Decimus, with its obviously manipulative nature that he made no attempt to hide, something that worked just as well as it did with Xal'atath. And as someone with no real emotional connection to Lothraxion, seeing him let himself be goaded into losing control and ultimately turning on us did feel like it had a germ of a good story trying to get out. But sadly, that really never came together. And by the time we got to Nexus Point Zenus to take him out, honestly, I really didn't care about his fate. Thankfully though, some of the side storylines were able to do a bit of heavy lifting. The story of Tulaman, the now thrice exile's heroic sacrifice, trapping herself in Voidstorm to ensure the safety of her people, was everything the main story wasn't. And for me, this was the best executed story questline in the history of World of Warcraft, depicting a character who, having never met the Alliance, was forced to use sign language to communicate us, unless of course we played a Draenei or Arcane Mage, who would be able to understand her native language. If you've been following my channel for long enough, you will know that I considered the War Within's level up experience and storyline to be the best that the game had ever released, and that always came with the danger that what was to come next would end up being a bit of a disappointment, and honestly that has turned out to be the case. If the War Within hadn't raised the bar so much, I have no doubt that I would have felt a bit better about Midnight's story, but at the same time I do think that it would still have fallen behind quite a few of the other recent expansions in terms of the quality of the delivery of that story. It is a little hard to put my finger on why I feel like this. Story flow and pacing did for sure play a major part, but I think there was also a bit more to it than that. That feeling of our characters losing power as we level up has been a feature of World of Warcraft ever since Burning Crusade, but in recent expansions you haven't really noticed it, at least until you hit max level. However, in Midnight that loss of power was very noticeable even before I hit the halfway mark of leveling up, meaning that it felt much worse even than Battle for Azeroth, and a major factor in that was how overpowered we were in the pre-patch, something that I suspect was a direct consequence of the developers' fear that the so-called add-on apocalypse would otherwise have resulted in a backlash had they unintentionally undershot player power in that pre-patch. There has been a lot of speculation in the community that Harandar was originally planned to be a patch zone in the War Within, and it has crossed my mind that perhaps Harandar and Koresh were swapped around at some point when the developers realised that having Koresh and Voidstorm in the same expansion would have felt far too samey. I don't know if this theory is true or not, but there was for sure something that just didn't feel right about the flow between Eversong, Harandar and Voidstorm, and this was also a contributor in making that overall narrative just not feel like it fully came together. And a final factor was the surprising absence of Xal'atath, despite her prominence in the pre-launch cinematics. In the War Within, Xal'atath's outstanding performances was a major factor in creating that epic feeling that the War Within's campaign had. And while good characters, Arathor, Zuljara and Arwena just aren't strong enough to fill that gap. But you know, the level up experience is of course a small part of the expansion as a whole, so now it's time to start taking a look at the max level experience. Starting with the campaign storyline, and sadly Blizzard appear to have regressed back to the bad old days of the likes of Battle for Azeroth, Shadowlands and the start of Dragonflight, where stories that otherwise had a lot of potential are torn apart into overly small and poorly paced episodes, which lack the time and space that they need to be memorable enough for us to recall them from episode to episode. The WoW team had made massive strides on this front since patch 10.10, and seeing them regress back to a model that has been the source of constant negative feedback from the community since Mists of Pandaria is just bizarre to me, and nothing sums that up greater than week 2 of the max level campaign, which for the overwhelming majority of the player base who don't raid or won't manage to clear the normal raid that week amounted to just 2 breadcrumb quests. The continuation of the story post Voidstorm does offer a tragic and very tense moment that should have been outstanding, but just simply isn't. And the reason for that is exactly the same reason that the Shadowlands story missed back in the day, which is poor pacing and botched direction. Those of course are very strong words, but Blizzard's developers had a golden opportunity to learn from the successes of the War Within, not to mention the misses that came before. But sadly, there is no sign of those lessons learned in the delivery of this story. Despite this, though, I did find this week's chapter on the perhaps temporary reunification of the Elvish nations to be quite enjoyable and satisfying, despite it having a couple of continuity-related plot holes. It's just a shame that I could not tell you what happened in chapter 1 of the story 2 weeks ago, thanks to that wider pacing problem. However, World of Warcraft of course always has been gameplay first. Let's be honest, storytelling in-game really only started to kick off in earnest in Mists of Pandaria, which means that the real measure of an expansion success or otherwise is going to be in its max level gameplay. Starting off with the open world content, and I was initially disappointed to see a continuation of the War Within's world quest model, where if one clears the map, which really doesn't take very long at all, level, then you go on to get about 1 quest per zone per day. But this is where something very surprising happened to me. When I first heard about the prey system, I had a ton of doubts about it. But when I gave it a try on the beta, I was very surprised about how well it interacted with the open world to give it a bit of a structure. Prey works at its best if you have a zone full of world quests. And for me, this has encouraged me to avoid falling into that trap of clearing the zone and then just making do with 1 quest per day. It is far more better to save them up and do an entire zone at a time with a prey quest. And this is a questing model that I am finding to be quite enjoyable. And on top of this, while I was initially very skeptical about hard and nightmare mode prey, which to me just looked like they would end up leaving us having to deal with annoying affixes, it's turned out I was wrong about that initial impression. Now, to be sure, I don't really find the affixes add anything positive to the gameplay experience, but at the same time they have avoided being annoying, with only the implicit timer of that stacking debuff being at all intrusive, and this has served to make the harder difficulties of prey a better experience than I expected them to be. Overall, I do expect to continue to use prey to give me some more structure to my open world experience. But once I do complete all the bosses on Nightmare mode once to earn that achievement mount, I expect that I will then just concentrate in normal mode, which for me is still the best version, supplemented by the odd hard mode prey as well. As I already mentioned, the affixes just don't add to the experience, and with delves offering the same gear as Nightmare mode, it just doesn't quite feel rewarding enough to want the extra difficulty or to deal with those affixes over the long term. That said, while prey is turning out to be pretty decent, Blizzard, by falling back on their old habits of relying on affixes that detract rather than enhance our gameplay experience to add difficulty, have in my view missed a bit of a major opportunity to add a lot more depth to that gameplay experience. Hunts, in my opinion, could have offered a very engaging search across the zone, following clues and overcoming obstacles on our way to the final boss. But instead, the truth is that being ambushed by your prey is far too predictable and unthreatening to be exciting, and having to watch your health leech away while your character is stunned with no way to avoid getting that stun in the first place was not good gameplay in that delve treasure in the War Within, and it isn't good gameplay here either. Prey is, unfortunately, an example of Blizzard overpromising and under-delivering, albeit despite that the feature does still offer some significant benefits. Prey is not a bad system, and in fact it's quite good, but it could and should have been a lot better than it has turned out to be. But Prey, of course, isn't the only open world content that's available. Salah Thrill's Soiree is a blending together of the Ashkahet reputation system, but this time with a lot more depth, along with Hallerfall Spreading the Light event and a mini open world event to boot. Perhaps surprisingly, these disparate elements have been brought together into something that offers surprising depth and variety. Having a choice of group to champion for the week negatively affect our standing with the others, but including a way to offset that negative effect serves to add both meaning but also strategy to our decision, and the questing element feels a lot more cohesive and also far more enjoyable than the one from Spreading the Light. I did find having to search for treasures to get the resource I needed to power up a runestone for the mini event to be a bit annoying the first time I did it, but thanks to those quests and the broader activity rewarding us with the resources that we need for subsequent weeks, this ultimately still came together in a way that offers some very satisfying progression. My only qualm is that it is fundamentally a weekly activity and isn't quite exciting enough to justify that cadence, but it is nevertheless a very enjoyable way to spend half an hour on a reset day. And then there's the Abundance event, which for me is a little bit of a strange beast. Collecting a limited time currency allows you to enter a mini dungeon where instead of having to fight enemies and a boss, you have to collect stuff instead. On paper, this sounds terminally dull, but in reality, it is the exact opposite, offering a short, just 3 minutes long experience of frenetic activity where you don't really understand what you're doing or why, but which nevertheless manages to tickle some very pleasant mental itches. The only real downside of Abundance is a confusing user interface. I still don't have a clue how I managed to earn the points that I do, nor how those points translate to the currency rewards I get at the end. but as long as I'm having a lot of fun, honestly, who cares? My only criticism of Abundance was the level of bugs in day one, something that resulted in many players losing out on important rewards from their very limited attempts. Put simply, this event was released in an unacceptably broken state, and it is one that reflects very badly on the development team's attitude towards the player base. Next up is Legends of Harrendar, which offers us a series of mini scenarios. As a story and questing experience, I really do enjoy these scenarios. But for a weekly activity, in my view, the scenarios are far too short, especially given that they are limited to doing one per account per week. In my opinion, this content really should have been a daily activity instead, although this would have required a lot more of those scenarios to exist. But that lack of scenarios, I think, is also going to be a problem with the weekly cadence. I mean, in 6 to 7 weeks' time, when these are all done, are we really going to want to continue to go back in every week just for a reward? Overall, this is something that, in my opinion, lacks repeatability. And while it does have its place in the game, that place really wasn't as a weekly event. Over in Voidstorm, and we get the Stormarian Keep, a tower defense minigame that lasts about 15 minutes. When I tried this for the first time, I kinda liked it and thought it might have had some potential. But sadly, that early positive feeling has very quickly palled. As well as the event being exactly the same every time you do it, it makes exactly the same design error that the developers made with the Researchers Under Fire event, which is that its success or failure is entirely dependent on how many players turn up. And that means that for me, I personally don't really feel like my efforts end up making any difference to the outcome, causing the event to regress to feeling just like pointless busy work. And when that is combined with that sameness, the end result is an event which lacks repeatability and overall feels very undercooked to me. And finally, we have the Argentina. Living in its own pocket dimension, the Argentina is an absolutely gorgeous looking space, and I would have loved to have had this cantina exist somewhere in the open world somehow. Gameplay wise, it offers us a single weekly quest to visit some old zone or perhaps an old instance, where as well as carrying out the quest activity, we're given the opportunity to locate an object to bring back to the Argentina, which we can then place on display. There is a lot to like about this feature. I personally have been asking to be given more relevant reasons to visit the old World of Warcraft since back in Battle for Azeroth, and as a collector, I love being able to build out the space and seeing the inn develop over time. But as with the Harrendar event, one quest per week simply isn't enough. For the Argentina to have real gameplay impact, what I think it really needed to have is around 3 to 4 quests, perhaps twice a week, or even just maybe 5 to 6 quests once a week. The end result is a feature with enormous potential, which is being badly let down by a lack of both depth and volume. And I cannot help but think that perhaps it would have been better if the resources that were spent on the Harrendar event could have instead been spent expanding the scope of the Argentina instead. One of the issues that I personally had with many of the middle of the War Within's patches was a feeling of a lack of depth in the content that was being released. A lack of depth that I personally think stems from the development team trying to put far too many things into their patches, resulting in them becoming spread far too thin. I would prefer to see fewer new things added, but with those things having a lot more depth and variety. Imagine what the Nightfall event that was released back in 11.15 could have been if the developer time that was spent in Dastardly Duels, and perhaps even bringing back Horrific Visions, had instead been used to build out that Nightfall event to a much greater extent. But just before I wrap up on this video, the open world isn't the only game in town, so let's take a look at the other main pillars of the game. The introduction of Delves to the War Within was a major success story for me. I personally love Delves, but at the same time, not all of the Delves in the War Within were the same. In that expansion, I had a few strong favourites, a few absolute duds, and a bunch of meh sitting in the middle. And over the lifetime of the expansion, I found myself spending the majority of my time in Delves in just about 4 or 5 of them. And what that did mean was that if I wanted to do just one bountiful Delve in any given day, the choice of which one to do was usually very easy to make. In contrast to this, in Midnight, I am genuinely finding myself struggling with what Delve to do in any given day. And the reason for that struggle is actually a surprisingly good one. The Midnight Delves so far have been consistently good, so much so that if you asked me to generate a tier list of those delves, I would really struggle to rank them against each other. No doubt over time I will eventually develop some preferences, but I'm pretty sure that every delve will end up being at least A tier, with rather a lot of S tiers in there as well. If you enjoyed delves in the War Within, then you are in for a treat. And even if you were someone who found that delves got a little bit old, I suspect that in Midnight they will end up lasting you a lot longer. Now, when I move over to look at the dungeons, the experience isn't quite so clear cut. There are a couple, Den of Nalarak and Mayasara Caverns in particular, that I do have some major concerns about for Mythic Plus. But even those particular dungeons were pretty decent in the pre-season period, and the other dungeons are ones that I have enjoyed a lot. I will cover the Season 1 Mythic Plus experience separately once we can get deeper into that, but for the start of the season, the 4 returning dungeons are also quite strong as well. I may not be a super fan of Pit of Sarin, but Algathar Academy was always a favourite for me, as was Skyreach when I encountered it in Time Walking. And even Seat of the Triumvirate has been massively improved on its last outing in the Legion expansion. Tuning wise, the very early Mythic Plus experience is that the dungeons are a little easier than we are used to, and even if this was not intended by the developers, I do expect this tuning to land very well with a Mythic Plus player base. Moving on to raiding, and Blizzard of course has decided to split the season into 3 raids at the start, with a 4th raid to follow later on. And this does bring a very different feel to the raiding season compared to what we've been used to in the modern era. Raiding has in recent expansions begun to feel a little stale, and was for me in need of a little bit of a shake-up. Whether this move to more than 1 raid per season will be the shake-up that was needed does remain to be seen, but as a tank my initial impressions have been fairly positive, albeit I do know that some DPS have been finding the fights to be a little bit flat due to Blizzard being a little bit conservative as a result of the add-on Apocalypse. More seriously, many players, especially at the higher end, are questioning if the raid is delivering on the benefits that were promised as part of that add-on Apocalypse. Now, the season proper has only been open a couple of days as I upload this video, and the final raid of the start, March of Quildanas, is still to come. So it really is too early to dive into the seasonal content in full depth, and that may well be something for a later rant, as will the final conclusion of the storyline. But with the Sunwell now shrouded in a void death beam and the Vanguard of the Light having been seemingly wiped out entirely, I am really interested to see where that story is going to go. Now, if you've made it this far through the video, then first of all, I do want to say a big thanks for sticking through my rants. But I suspect that you might be starting to think that my overall conclusion is going to lead towards negativity, in which case you're in for a little bit of a surprise. While some aspects of the Midnight launch content for sure has some flaws, the max level open world content loop nevertheless has come together in a way that I'm finding very satisfying experience wise, and it's one that is a noticeable improvement over the War Withins, or even the start of Dragonflight. I do have some concerns about the repeatability of some of the content, which does raise some major questions about its longevity, and I don't think it's quite back to the heights of the Legion BFA World Quest loop, but it nevertheless offers a very strong foundation for the developers to build on. What comes next is entirely in the hands of the dev team. If they can avoid a repeat of the serious quality issues that was the War Within's minor patch's major feature, the already announced plans for the first 12.05 patch, if executed well, could put us on a path which will lead to something special. The opportunity is there should the WoW team be willing and able to grasp it. And as for the seasonal content, the lack of any significant red flags, combined with that very strong foundational content, tells much the same story. The upcoming return of bonus roles in a form which will seek to avoid and address some of those issues that the runaway RNG of Legion and BFA era brought does offer a lot of potential to take seasonal progression to brand new heights. If I was to give the World of Warcraft dev team one bit of feedback, it would be this. I think that the open world content could benefit from having fewer new things added, but for those things to have a lot more depth and variety. For some time now, there has been a very strong vibe that you, the WoW dev team, are spreading yourselves far too thin. And I think that this change would massively benefit players by offering us a much more focused and sometimes less overwhelming experience to boot. But anyways, that's my initial thoughts on the new Midnight expansion. I'd be super interested to hear your thoughts as well. What parts of the expansion are you enjoying and what parts are you avoiding? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found this guide helpful, entertaining, or even just plain annoying, then you can let me know by hitting that like icon. And if you want to support my channel to grow and help me to make more of these videos along with my other content, then hit that subscribe button right now before you forget. If you don't want to miss out whenever I release a new video, then as well as subscribing, you can follow me on social media for updates. My link's in the description below as well. I've also started streaming on Twitch on Wednesdays, Saturdays and Sundays, and you can find a link to my channel below. And I hope you'll be able to join me on my journey of exploration through Midnight. That's all for now. Thanks for watching.